the inspiration of for this paper is an idea that appears in both of the two sort of famous papers in the 1950s of Harsanyi, in which he sort of argues that, I mean, he's making an argument for utilitarianism, which I'm not going to do, but his starting point is the idea that in order to understand what is required of us when engaging in moral evaluation of different social states of affairs, the way to do it is to sort of put ourselves into the shoes of an impartial, a rational, impartial, but sympathetic observer. Somebody who was sort of responsive to the well-being of individuals and who made judgments about the relative merits of different social circumstances from an impartial perspective. And that's, you know, I don't think one needs to sort of accept the idea that that the impartial standpoint is constitutive in any kind of way of the social standpoint, in order to sort of think that it's a sort of a powerful idea for understanding what judgments, particularly judgments in the sort of social or public policy arena, what form they're required to have. So Harsanyi's idea, which is, you know, sort of his theorem, has been enormously influential and has been generalized and extended in all kinds of ways, in particular, the extension of his work to the context of uncertainty, of probabilistic subjective uncertainty, has become quite well known in philosophy through the work of John Broome, whose book Weighing Goods is a sort of sustained defense of Harsanyi's theorem. But has also, you know, been extended into even further than that. And the paper of Marcus and Philippe Mongin that I mentioned is right at the end of that chain of activity. But it's also been, you know, criticized in two ways that sort of matter to my paper. I mean, the first kind of criticism or challenge that has been offered to it concerns the rationality assumptions that underlie Harsanyi's theorem. There are, I mean, for many people, the assumptions make it inapplicable to circumstances that decision theorists call circumstances of ambiguity, in which, for one or another reason, agents find it difficult to assign at least precise probabilities to the various states of the world that they're dealing with, and others, you know, for very different motivations, have criticized these assumptions on the grounds that, I mean, the assumptions that are encoded there are basically assumptions that give you an expected utility framework, have argued that that's not sufficiently permissive and that it rules out all kinds of attitudes to risk and uncertainty that are perfectly reasonable. So one thing I'll be doing is relaxing those assumptions to a large extent. And the second line of criticism that's very prominent, particularly in the philosophical literature of Harsanyi's result, is directed at the Pareto, the sort of so-called ex-ante Pareto condition, which I'll give a statement of later, on the grounds that this condition forces social evaluation to be insensitive to equality. Although, you know, my primary focus here is on sort of the ambiguity side, not on the equality side, I will also allow that, you know, make space for that criticism by weakening the Pareto condition. So there's a weakening of the rationality assumptions sufficiently to allow us to explore social evaluation under ambiguity. And then also this, you know, I'll be weakening the Pareto condition too. Surprisingly, even in this very weakened framework, as we'll see, you still get quite strong constraints on the form that social evaluation can take, much stronger than I certainly had expected when I first started working on it. I hope you are sort of a bit surprised by it too. I should say I'll stop sort of at a couple of points in this talk for clarificatory questions. I think we've sort of moved a little bit out of the old choice group manner in which it's a sort of free for all and people make criticism comments whenever they feel like it. But I would like to kind of, at very least, allow clarification questions at the crucial bit. So I will stop. Feel free to take it. Okay. So let's start by setting out the framework here. I'm not going to do things very formally. I'm sure it will be obvious to all of you how what this would look like if it was made a lot tighter. So in the background here is some set of well-being values. We're going to assume that set is convex for convenience. There's some set of individuals, and there's some set of states of the world, the usual things. And what we're going to be looking at is evaluations of distributions of well-being across individuals and across states of the world. And this is the vocabulary that I'm going to be using. I'm going to talk about, when I talk about individual prospects, I'm talking about distributions of well-being across states of the world to particular individuals. So for instance, this here, that's Jocelyn's individual prospect. It consists of a distribution of well-being to her in the 3 states that are displayed in this table. When I speak of social outcomes, I'm talking about distributions of well-being within a state, but across individuals. So here's a social outcome. This is the social outcome in state 1. And social prospects are the whole table. So distributions of social outcomes across states, or if you like, distributions across both states and individuals. It's these social prospects that are the primary objects of evaluation. These are the things that the impartial evaluator wants to get a grip on, wants to evaluate. And here, I mean, in the usual fashion, I'm going to be capturing these properties of ethical evaluation by the properties of things called betterness rankings. So we'll be looking at betterness rankings of social prospects and the relationship between these rankings and betterness rankings of individual prospects and of social outcomes. I mean, all of this, I'm sure, is very familiar to a lot of you, but in case it's not to everybody, I'll go through. So when I talk about a betterness ranking, just to sort of fix things so I don't have to make these assumptions explicit again, I mean a complete transitive and continuous relation on the distribution that is monotonic in well-being. And by monotonic in well-being, I just mean that one distribution cannot be better than another distribution unless it's better for at least one individual in at least one state of the world. So it's a rather sort of minimal sensitivity to well-being requirement. I mean, it's just to fix the idea that well-being is what matters here. So that's what betterness rankings are, and we have them for both individual prospects and social prospects and social outcomes. I'm not going to make any assumptions about what well-being is, but I do require that it be measurable and comparable. So just sort of think of it as a cardinally measurable, interpersonally comparable quantity, where you can fill in with whatever theory of well-being that you like. I mean, it could be, these numbers could be generated via sort of a Neumann-Morgan style lotteries for preferences over these things. It could come from some sort of index over leisure, well-being, leisure, income, etc. However, whatever your favorite theory is, you plug in here. It won't matter to the formal results. Of course, it will matter. It might matter a lot to what you think their significance is, but I won't say anything more about it. I'm also not going to assume that the evaluator here is fully informed about any facts relevant to determining what is best. So well-being is given, so and the evaluator is informed by the setup of what the final well-being outcome is for individuals. But there's no assumption that the evaluator, in some senses, got special access to the whatever properties of these distributions determine what's best. We're in the realm of sort of potentially mistaken judgment here by the social evaluator, impartial but potentially mistaken. And finally, in the basic setup, there's going to be no assumption about the kind of uncertainty faced. So the setup will allow that we can think that we're in a situation of risk where probabilities are given. It will allow that we can think we're in a situation of uncertainty where subjective probabilities apply. It will allow that we're in a situation of ambiguity in which there aren't any probabilities to be had. No precise probabilities to be had. So the sort of the upshot of all of this sort of fact that I'm not making many assumptions about several of these key ingredients here will give the results very wide scope. At least that's the thought here. But you should be able to fill in with your own interests in lots and lots of places here. Most of the action, as always, is going to be around the sensitivity of these betterness rankings to uncertainty and equality. So let me just again sort of fix a little bit of vocabulary here. So if to illustrate, suppose we've got a very simple social prospect like the one on the over here, in which we've got two states of the world. Let's just, I often just sort of take it that the states of the world are equiprobable or indistinguishable for the purposes of illustration. Just makes things a little bit easier, but whenever we move to sort of more general case, I'll signal that. So suppose we've got this very simple distribution of well-being to Jocelyn and Kit across these two worlds. Then we can define something called the certainty equivalent for the prospects that they face. And so what I mean by the certainty equivalent for an individual, say Jocelyn, is just the distribution across those two states. So this doesn't depend on the states being equiprobable. So the red herring there, doesn't matter what the... when I speak of a certainty equivalent for Jocelyn, what I mean is a distribution of well-being to Jocelyn, which is such that she gets the same well-being in every state of the world, and which is equally good as the original distribution. So this distribution, if it's the certainty equivalent for Jocelyn, is as good for Jocelyn as this one. Okay, and likewise for Kit here. And we can say of the individual betterness relations that are concerned here, that Kit's individual betterness relation, now we require the equiprobability assumption in the background. We can say that Kit's betterness ranking is neutral with regard to the background risk or uncertainty, because Kit's certainty equivalent, the number here that you fill in for the certainty equivalent, is just the mean value of the distribution to Kit in the starting 50-50 average of 0 and 2, 1 and 1. Similarly, we can say here that Jocelyn's betterness ranking is risk or uncertainty averse, depending on what kind of uncertainty we're dealing with in the background, or ambiguity averse. Because here the expected the certainty equivalent for Jocelyn is smaller than the expected value of the distribution that we started. If you are uncertainty neutral, this will be half-half here. Okay, so it's familiar. Most of you read already. We can do exactly the same thing for. I should just sort of mention, as you get. I mean, we know that the certainty, these equivalents exist because we assumed that the background set of well-being is convex, and we assume that these betterness relations are both continuous and monotonic. So we can be sure that these things exist. Okay, similarly on the equality dimension, now we're looking at sort of equality equivalents for particular states of the world. We're looking in this direction, so the equality equivalent for this social outcome here I'm giving as 0.4, 0.4, and what that means is that this equal distribution across Jocelyn and Kit is equally good as this unequal distribution to Jocelyn and Kit. That's what makes it the equality equivalent of this distribution. And similarly here we have the equality distribution, the equivalent for the second state. And in similar fashion, we can distinguish between cases where the betterness relation of social outcomes is inequality averse, from those which are inequality neutral. Of course, we might also have inequality seeking, but won't come into the discussion at all. For exactly the same, on exactly the same grounds, this one is inequality neutral because the number here is just the expected value of the distribution here. This one is averse because this number is lower than the expected value of the mean value of the distribution on here. All right, so that's just vocabulary that we're going to be using here. Now let me move on to the axioms, the main assumptions set up. So the first one is impartiality. And I mean, if there's anything sort of a little bit differently about the way that I'm approaching it, is that I sort of start with impartiality and add stuff to that. It's very often in this sort of field of Harsanyi inspired results. Impartiality is a kind of bolt-on that you get at the end. And actually, it's not even sort of clear that impartiality has any clear meaning within Harsanyi's own setup, because he's got these von Neumann-Morgenstern, uses the von Neumann-Morgenstern framework to cardinalize them, and then it's sort of unclear whether interpersonal comparisons can be made in that framework. But I'm just sort of, setting aside all those considerable difficulties by assuming that we have an interpersonally cardinal measure right up front. And so impartiality has very clear meaning in this context. And what it means for me is that two outcomes, the impartiality requirement is simply that if you shuffle the outcomes to individuals in a particular state of the world, it doesn't make any difference from the point of view of betterment. So, for example, in the sort of blue and yellow example here, in blue, Jocelyn gets well-being 1 and Kit gets well-being 3, and in the yellow, it's just the other way around. So clearly, you can get this social outcome by shuffling this one, reshuffling this one, and because that's so, I say this satisfies the impartiality requirement. So you would satisfy this impartiality requirement if it would be satisfied if the betterness relation was such as to regard these as equally good. So that's there. Campbell Brown has actually, pointed out to me, he's got a paper on this, that there are subtle variants to the notion of impartiality. There are weaker notions of and he's got some objections to the stronger versions of the stronger version of the impartiality requirement that I have up here, and he's pointed out to me that there are weaker versions that in fact will almost certainly do for everything that comes later in the paper. I'm not going to worry about that complication now because I think most people think this notion of impartiality is fairly intuitive, but for those of you who really like to dig down on these things, fill in with Campbell's weaker requirements where appropriate. Okay, so hereafter, impartiality is, not under discussion, as it were. It's taken for granted. Second, more or less taken for granted assumption is the assumption of state dominance, and I'm taking this for granted because there's no mainstream theory of decision making that doesn't assume it. So I guess you all know what state dominance says, but just to be clear, the idea here is that if one prospect is better in every state of the world, then it's better overall. So this is in terms of, if the betterness, if it's better in every state, let me just state it. If in every state, social prospects, one prospect, social prospect X, or the blue prospect is an example, has at least as good an outcome as the rival prospect Y, then X is at least as good overall as Y. And furthermore, if there's one state in which X has a better outcome than Y, then X is strictly better overall than Y. So for example, if given impartiality, we can already say that blue and, state 2, that blue and yellow have exactly the same prospect. In state 3, they have one that's sort of equal under the sort of under reshuffling. And so this state dominance tells us that blue is better, worse, or equally good than the yellow prospect, just in case this ranking, this distribution is better, worse, or equally good as this one. That would follow state dominance, for example. Okay, I hope that's a relatively uncontroversial assumption. A much more controversial assumption, and it's not one that I'm going to make, but it's one that figures prominently in Harsanyi's results and in most of the generalizations of his results that have followed from it, is a so-called strong or ex-ante Pareto condition. And we can think of that condition as being the state dominance condition, but just sort of flipped on its side, so that the dominance relations now refer to individuals rather than states of the world. So what this condition says, intuitively, is that if one prospect is better for every individual, then it's better overall. We can break that down again into these two clauses. One, that if it's at least as good for every individual, then it's at least as good overall. And furthermore, if it's strictly better for at least one individual, then it's strictly better overall. So that's the sort of usual strong Pareto condition that we find in results in this case. I want to say a little bit more about this one because this is a somewhat more controversial assumption. First, though, let me say a little bit about how I'm thinking about individual betterness here. So there are really, I think, kind of three main classes of interpretations that one finds in the literature of this notion of individual betterness. So I've said sort of social betterness for me is the judgment of this impartial evaluator. It captures their judgment. But I haven't said anything about what the individual betterness relation captures. So perhaps the most common interpretation of it is that they somehow reflect individual subjective preferences over distributions of well-being. And then the sort of exercise is thought of as one in which the social evaluator tries to accommodate individual preferences consistently with the various constraints that they adopt. That interpretation has been pretty, it's going to just turn out to be flatly ruled out by this framework. It's, when you see the first main result, you'll see that interpretation is not sustainable. And it's not sustainable for much the same reasons that it's been criticized heavily by John Broome, who's argued that sort of, what matters when thinking about what's best overall is not what individuals prefer, but what's good for them. And that's what I'm calling the objective interpretation of individual betterness here. It's that these represent what's, as a matter of fact, or objectively speaking, is better for individuals, irrespective of what they think about that. And in particular, irrespective of what they believe and what attitudes they take to inequality, not to inequality, to uncertainty. The interpretation that I prefer, but I don't think anything that I say will sort of depend on whether you go with 2 or 3 here, is what I'm calling an internalist interpretation. It's not a terribly good term, so if anybody's got a better one, I would be happy to hear it. Where the thought is here is that these individual betterness relations represent judgments of the social evaluator as to what's good for the individual concerned. So the exercise here is not calibrating the judgments of the social evaluator to some objective facts, but is about consistency in the judgments of the social evaluator between their judgments about what's best overall and their judgments about what's best for individuals. Think about it, but as I say, it'll turn out that the first interpretation is not sustainable, but the other 2 will be fine. Okay, so that's a little bit of a little side remark. The main point that I want to make here is that this is to point to the fact that this ex-ante Pareto condition has been quite heavily criticized in the literature on the grounds that it forces the social betterness relation to be insensitive to inequality. And the easiest way to see it is with a sort of simple example like we have here. So if you look at blue prospect and yellow prospect here, from the point of view of both Jocelyn and Kit, they're indistinguishable, at least they're indistinguishable here, if we assume that the 2 states themselves have equal probability or under situations of ambiguity, they're indistinguishable. So for both Jocelyn and Kit, because they can't distinguish the 2 states, it doesn't matter which one is the one in which they get 1 and which one they get 0. Or in fact, the way I've got it here is it's just the same for Jocelyn. But for Kit, there's a sort of flipping around of the states in which they get the well-being of 1. But the point is that for both individuals, these 2 prospects are equally good, and so the ex-ante Pareto condition forces the social evaluator to regard them as equally good. But, say many, there's something clearly better about the yellow prospect. It's a prospect in which there's never any inequality in the ex-post outcomes. I'm not going to comment on, I'm not going to take a view on the sort of the force of that objection, but I am going to accommodate it by weakening the Pareto conditions, both to sort of eliminate that problem. At least in my view, I would eliminate the problem. And the sort of inspiration for that is to just is to see that there are some cases where we do want to apply the Pareto condition. So, for instance, if we're comparing blue and green here, we do think that in this case, the fact that both Jocelyn and Kit are indifferent between these 2, between their individual prospects in these 2 cases, are good grounds for the social evaluator to be indifferent between the 2 of them. And that's because the objection doesn't apply here. In both, if you like, blue and green are sort of can't be differentiated in terms of the ex-post, in features of the ex-post equality that they provide. So that's the kind of intuitive thought behind the weakening of the Pareto condition that I'm going to use. I call this Pareto for equivalent outcomes. And it just simply adds one clause to the ex-ante Pareto condition, the clause that requires the social outcomes of the two prospects being compared to be as equal as each other. Okay, so it says if in every state the social outcome prospect X is as equal as the social outcome of prospect Y, then then the rest of the Pareto kind of follows suit. So obviously all the action here is in what do I mean by as equal as, and I think there's lots of interesting things to be, lots of interesting proposals for ways one might fill that in. All I need is sort of two features of whatever that relation, what that full relation is. One is in the case where individual outcomes are the same, so the individual in each state, the individuals get the same well-being in both of the prospects that are being compared. Then I will regard those as equivalent from an equality point of view, for one case. And the other case is when one social outcome is simply a reshuffling. In that state, the social outcome is just a reshuffling of the other, the two prospects. So those are the two cases which I say count. If either of those two are true of the prospects that we're comparing, then I say they're indistinguishable from an equality point of view, and so we can apply. So that's the framework. So this is one of the points where I think I'll stop and see if there are any questions of clarification.
You can raise your hand in the participant box.
Oh yeah, I should say, yeah. Use the participant thing, because I can see it should float up to the top, so I should be able to see if there is. Okay, good. Either I'm being crystal clear or nobody cares. So let me tell you what the results are at that point, what the sort of main results are, and then the rest of this will be sort of showing you why we get those results. So we have our three conditions. So we assume social betterness satisfies the impartiality condition, state dominance, and the Pareto for equivalent outcomes. Then three things follow. The first is that all individual betterness relations are the same. The second is that both individual betterness and social betterness is required to be both risk and uncertainty, including ambiguity, neutral. So no uncertainty attitudes, disallowed by expected utility theory are permissible in this framework. And so you should be horrified at this point, I hope. And even more strongly, betterness, both individual and social, is strongly separable. So the individual and social betterness relations must satisfy the sure thing principle in particular. So that follows from these three rather weak conditions. And now I want to sort of show you why they do. And I obviously won't be able to do any great detail for all three, but I'll work my way through one and hopefully a bit of the two to give you a sense of why this happens. And then we can discuss what this means. Okay, so the first claim was about the sort of homogeneity of individual betterness claim. And we did just this to get our results. We need to do it in two steps. In the first step, we show that impartiality and state dominance imply that a reshuffling of individual prospects doesn't affect how good a social prospect is. In other words, we have something like prospect anonymity is a consequence in this framework. Okay, so let's see what happens. So consider these two very simple social prospects, but in a way the setup is perfectly general. And you can see that yellow here is just a reshuffling of the assignment of prospects to individuals. It's a reshuffling of the assignment that we find in blue of prospects to individuals. So in blue, it's the XYZ goes to Jocelyn, and in yellow, it goes to Kit. And similarly for the ABC aspect. All right. So notice if we go state by state, in every state, the outcome to Jocelyn and Kit in the yellow case is simply a reshuffling of the outcome in the blue one. So for instance, this outcome in state 1 here, the social outcome here in the yellow is just a reshuffling of the outcome in the blue one. And that's true of all the states. And so, and that's, so by impartiality, we must regard those social outcomes as equally good. And then state dominance tells us that these prospects must be equally good. Okay, so that's step 1. And the second step is to show that given the prospect anonymity, which we've just proven, all individual betterness relations have to be the same. So to do that, just suppose, again, that we've got this sort of XYZ distribution to Jocelyn, and that the distribution JJJ in every state of the world is the certainty equivalent for Jocelyn. Okay. And then we set things up in the way that I have it here, where Jocelyn gets the XYZ in the green prospect, and Kit gets Jocelyn's certainty equivalent. In the gray prospect, Jocelyn gets her certainty equivalent, and Kit gets the XYZ prospect. All right. Right, we already know that from our previous result that the social evaluator must be indifferent between these two prospects because of prospect anonymity. But now we also know that Jocelyn must be indifferent between these two because by definition she must be, because this is her certainty equivalent here. So, but we can apply our Pareto condition in this case, because if we go state by state, we see that in every state the outcome is just a matter of reshuffling the outcomes between the two individuals. So these two prospects are equivalent from the point of view of equality. So we can apply Pareto. And so it follows from the Pareto condition that, and given that the social evaluator is indifferent between these two, and given that Jocelyn is indifferent between these two, the Kit must also be indifferent between the XYZ prospect and the JJJ prospect. Okay. And this is irrespective of probabilities across the state of the world or anything like that, right? Kit must be indifferent between these two, because if for instance, Kit certainty equivalent for X, Y, and Z was some number greater than J, the distribution of J's that were greater than, the numbers greater than J here, then the Pareto condition would require the social evaluator to strictly prefer green to gray, if I've got this the right way around, and that would be in contradiction to what we said impartiality requires, partiality and state dominance require. Okay, so saying that JJJ here is also the certainty equivalent for Kit is just a sort of another way of saying that Kit and Jocelyn have the same betterness relations, because it doesn't matter what prospect we start with. For every prospect that we start with, we can construct examples like this, and it will turn out they're the same certainty equivalent, and therefore their betterness relations must be the same. So that's the first step. That's the first claim. Perhaps I won't stop here for discussion, because I think in a way this result is not quite as troubling as it might at first appear. So the first thing I should say is that for many people, this will be a familiar result, in the sense that it's sort of it's a well-known consequence of the full Pareto condition inside the sort of Bayesian version of the setup, where you assume expected utility theory as your theory of rationality in the background. So in the much stronger framework in which you have sort of expected utility theory plus the full ex-ante Pareto, then it's a known consequence that individual betterness relations have to be the same. And indeed, it features very prominently in Broom's argument for the objective interpretation of betterness. And Broom's sort of diffusing of this result is to say, well, once we understand that this is about objective betterness, then it's kind of, and the well-being numbers represent the same thing for individuals, so well-being for one individual is the same as well-being for another, it's really not surprising that the betterness, the betterness relation for individuals would be the same. So in that framework, it's tantamount to saying individuals, ought to ascribe the same probabilities to the outcomes, and that's reasonable if this is sort of about the objective fact, and ought to take the same attitudes, perhaps to the uncertainty that they face. But in this sort of much more permissive environment, it might nonetheless be a little bit surprising that individual betterness relations can't display different kinds of sensitivity to the uncertainty around. So another way of saying this is that this rules out the possibility that individual betterness is sensitive to uncertainty in a way that depends on characteristics of the individual. I think that's a little bit surprising, but disastrous. Disastrous if you have a subjective interpretation. Otherwise not. Okay, so let me move on to the ambiguity, and then I'll stop with it. Because this is great. So the sort of question here, and this was really the question that kind of got me going in the first place, was what form should rational impartial evaluation take in situations of ambiguity, so that, situations in which it's difficult for individuals to assign, and perhaps for the social evaluator to assign precise probabilities to the states of the world. And I guess in the context of this audience, I don't need to say very much about to motivate the possibility of being averse to ambiguity of this kind, and the possibility of displaying preferences or even betterness relations that violate some of the requirements of expected utility theory. But as you all know, the sort of background to this are things like the Ellsberg paradox, and I'm going to set it out because I will use the sort of Ellsberg preferences as the example as I carry this through. So this is one of the two Ellsberg paradoxes. This is the two-urn paradox, in which individuals, so it's now individual betterness relations, but I'll talk about preferences because that's the original Ellsberg setup. Individuals are contemplating bets over two urns. One urn is the risky urn, in which the proportions of the black and white balls are known. The other, and they're known to be 50-50, let's say. And the other is the so-called ambiguous urn, where we know there are black and white balls, but we don't know the proportions. And here we have social prospects that correspond really to well-being that derives from bets on what ball is drawn from this urn. So the risky black prospect is the prospect that's generated by the individual concerned here, getting well-being one just in case a black ball is drawn, and getting no well-being otherwise. And the risky white is just the one in which they get the well-being in case the white ball is drawn from the risky urn. So I should say here the big B in this thing here, the big B refers to the color of the ball, the black ball being drawn from the risky urn, and the little b refers to the case where it's drawn from the ambiguous urn. And so this is, this event here is the event of a black ball from the risky urn. In the case of the ambiguous urn, so this is, these two cells that matter here, this is the case in which a black ball is drawn from the ambiguous urn, and this is the case in which it's drawn from the white ball. All right, and so what Ellsberg observed, and many people find this convincing, is that even though one might be indifferent between risky black and risky white, in cases where, in these cases, one's equally indifferent between ambiguous black and ambiguous white, it's reasonable to prefer risky black to ambiguous black and risky white to ambiguous white. And that's because there's more uncertainty around when you are betting on draws from the ambiguous. And particularly, you have no idea what the probability distribution is because you don't know what the proportion is. That's the sort of standard story. Everybody knows that. And although this is a highly idealized setup, I think we encounter lots and lots of situations, in practical life, as it were, where things are not as clean as this, but where we are faced with courses of action in which we're comparing courses of action, where you know, we're going down relatively well-trodden paths against ones where there's a lot more uncertainty around, and this gives we have reason to prefer following the more well-trodden paths. Think of sort of two medical interventions, one which has been used time and time again, one which is totally new. Survival probabilities are the same. Surely you would take a medical intervention that's been around for a while. That's the thought. Yeah. Okay, so that's if you want me to say more about why ambiguity aversion is justified, we can do so in the questions, but it's anything. Because the important thing here is our setup rules out ambiguity aversion in the case of individual betterness. That's the first claim that I want to establish. So for this, we're going to need, again, impartiality and state dominance, and we're going to need the Pareto for equivalent outcomes, in which we make use of the sort of reshuffling laws. The equivalence, yeah. Okay, so here's the setup. Now we're supposing Jocelyn and Kit are facing, you know, the two-earn problem. And for argument's sake, let's suppose that Jocelyn and Kit are ambiguity averse. So because they're ambiguity averse, that means that both Jocelyn and Kit are going to prefer this blue prospect to the yellow prospect, because the yellow prospect is both of them get the draw, get a draw from the ambiguous earn, and the blue prospect is one where they both get a draw from a risky earn. Okay, they're winning on different colors, notice, and crucial to the setup here. But they're agreed that blue is better because their draw depends on the risky rather than the ambiguous. My hypothesis. Okay, so, Pareto for equivalent outcomes applies in this case, because notice if we go state by state, in every case, we're just dealing with a simple reshuffling. And so these two prospects don't differ in terms of their equality characteristics, so we can apply Pareto. That means that it follows from the Pareto condition that blue prospect is strictly preferred to yellow prospect. However, that can't be so, because by impartiality and state dominance, the social evaluator must regard these as equally good. Okay, to see that again. Observe yet again that the outcomes in these two are simply reshuffle. You know, each time it's just a reshuffling of the outcome in the previous one. Okay, so all of these social outcomes are equally good from the social perspective. And so by state dominance, blue prospect is equally good as yellow prospect. Okay, so we started with the assumption that Jocelyn and Kit were ambiguity averse, and we derive a contradiction, so we infer that they cannot both be. But remember, we've already proved that all individual betterness relations are the same. So if they can't both be, neither can be. And the same obviously applies for ambiguity loving. So individual betterness has to be ambiguity neutral. You can make a similar argument for ambiguity neutrality of the social betterness relation. This time we use the other clause on the Pareto condition. So you can, you know, if you don't like both of my clauses, you can sort of you can pick some and get half of these results and not the other. All right, so to see why social betterness is ambiguity neutral, let's now consider a slightly more general case. So we're thinking of, whoops, so there's definitely maybe this. I need to wrap up. So I will do this and then I will wrap up. So here we have a case so here again, we've got the same kind of setup here. But remember, we already know that Jocelyn and Kit are ambiguity neutral. So we know that they're ambiguity neutral. And we also have the impartiality and state dominance in play here, which is going to tell us that these two prospects are equally good. But we can't apply our Pareto condition directly to this prospect. So we need to move from this one to a slightly different set of prospects, which is I'm going to call risky black star and ambiguous black star. And in these, and risky black star relates to risky black by the fact that I replace, the well-being outcomes to the individuals by the equality. Sorry, I replace the social outcomes in the original prospects by the equality equivalence. So by definition of the equality equivalence, risky black is equally good. Risky black star is equally good as risky black, and ambiguous black star is equally good as ambiguous black. That just comes from the definition of equality equivalence and state dominance. But now we can apply our Pareto condition. Okay, so by our Pareto condition, we can see that we can now use the fact that we know that for both Jocelyn and Kit, these two, they're indifferent between blue and yellow. Both of them are indifferent between the two of them because we already know that they're ambiguity and neutral. And so by the Pareto for equivalent outcomes, these must be equally good for the social evaluator. But that means that the social evaluator has to be ambiguity neutral. Because in this case, the social evaluator is facing distributions of well-being to individuals that you get the good distribution on draws from an ambiguous urn, and here you get the good distributions on the draws from the risky urns. So the social evaluator is forced to be ambiguity neutral too. All right, so Nicholas is telling me I should finish off, so I'm just going to simply tell you that the argument that individual and social betterness must respect the separability conditions looks, almost the same as the argument that we've just seen for the ambiguity neutrality, and I guess that's no surprise to you because these things are very closely related. So you can sort of see for yourself how that's going to go. So we can skip that demonstration and just move to the conclusion here. So what I'd like to sort of dress this up as a trilemma, sort of in the honor of Christian List, I guess. Christian, everything is a trilemma in the end. The trilemma that this presents us with is the fact that we cannot, given our assumptions, satisfy the following three desiderata on social betterness. That on the one hand, the social betterness be impartial. On the other hand, that it allow for sensitivity to ambiguity or uncertainty or risk, or sensitivity to forms of ambiguity, allow forms of ambiguity aversion or risk aversion and so on, of the kind that is normally ruled out by expected utility theory, but which many people, myself included, feel is entirely appropriate in certain kinds of situations. And the third desideratum here is that it respects sort of unanimity in individual cases, in the situations in which there's no implications for equality. So that's just the Pareto condition kind of dressed up again, as it were. I think in the interest of time, I'm not going to say now which of, what I think are the kind of escape routes out of this. I think that's the kind of interesting discussion to be had, provided everybody accepts the results here. None of them on the face of it are terribly attractive, I would have thought. But then, that's fluff. So I'll stop there and hand back over to Nick.